Around 3 in the morning, rain pouring down, Kira Walsh knelt beside a stranger curled up in a dark alley. The girl's lips had turned purple, her breathing fading. Kira had only one thing keeping her warm, a wool scarf her mother had knitted before she passed away. Without hesitation, she unwrapped it and draped it around the stranger's shoulders, then pulled the girl to her feet and walked into the rain with nothing but a thin, cleaning uniform clinging to her skin. Kira had no idea that girl was the sister of Barrett Gallagher, the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld, a name that made even hardened criminals look away. And she never could have imagined that one worn-out scarf would drag her into a world where kindness could be the most dangerous thing but also the only thing that could change everything. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button to support us. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you never miss the next story. But to understand why Kira Walsh ended up on her knees in a dark alley at 3 o'clock in the morning, we need to turn back a few hours earlier. Kira Walsh was used to not being seen by anyone. 27 years old, 10 years of raising herself, and not once had anyone called her by name at the place where she worked. Every night, she pushed a cleaning cart through the silent hallways of Mercer Tower, a 40-story office building in downtown Chicago. By day, the place was filled with perfectly tailored suits, polished leather shoes crossing the marble lobby. By night, there was only Kira, the sound of water sloshing in the mop bucket, and the flicker of fluorescent lights in the basement. Her shift began at 6 o'clock in the evening and ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. 8 hours of mopping floors, scrubbing toilets, emptying trash, wiping glass. 8 hours in which no one said a single word to her except the security guard, who nodded when she swiped her access card in and out. She didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury for people who had choices. Kira didn't have choices. 10 years earlier, her mother died on a winter morning. She lay in a hospital bed for 3 months, and the last thing she did before closing her eyes was hand Kira the wool scarf she had been knitting. She had finished the final stitches the night before, while Kira had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed. The gray yarn had faded, and she had patched 2 places with yarn of another color because she couldn't afford to buy the same kind. But the scarf was thick and warm. It was the last thing her mother left her. After her mother died, Kira's father began to drink. Not all at once, but slowly, the way water seeps into a wall. First, 1 glass every night, then 2 glasses, then a whole bottle. Then he stopped going to work. Then he stopped looking at Kira. Then one morning, Kira woke up and the house was empty. He had left without a single note. At 17, Kira stood in the middle of that empty house with the wool scarf around her neck, and she understood that from that moment on, she had only herself. 10 years later, she still had only herself. Tonight was no different. Kira stepped out of the back door of Mercer Tower at 2 o'clock in the morning. The rain had started falling at midnight, and now it was coming down harder, the wind blowing in bitter waves that slipped through her thin uniform. She wrapped the wool scarf around her neck, pulled it tighter, and began to walk. Her car had been broken for 3 weeks. The repair shop had quoted her $400. She didn't have $400. She didn't even have an extra $100. So she walked. 40 minutes every night, from Mercer Tower back to her studio apartment in Bridgeport. She was used to it. Rain or snow, heat or cold, she walked. The road home at 2 o'clock in the morning in Chicago wasn't a place meant for a woman walking alone. She knew that. But she also knew fear couldn't pay the rent. So she kept walking. Kira's studio apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, with concrete stairs that had no lights and a warped wooden door that had to be shoved hard before it would open. Inside, there was just enough room for a single bed, a tiny kitchen, and a refrigerator with almost nothing in it. She opened the refrigerator, looked inside, then closed it again. She boiled a kettle of hot water, poured it into a cup, and drank it in place of dinner. The warm water filled her stomach just enough for sleep. She had done that on so many nights that she no longer recognized it as something unusual. Kira sat on the bed, both hands wrapped around the cup, looking out the window. The rain was still pouring. She thought about tomorrow's shift, about the rent due at the end of the month, about the car she didn't know when she would ever be able to fix. Then she set the cup down, pulled the blanket up, and closed her eyes. But tonight, Kira couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned for a long time, then sat up. She put her cleaning uniform back on, wrapped the wool scarf around her neck, and stepped outside. Not because she had somewhere to go, only because the four walls of the studio apartment felt more suffocating than the storm outside. She walked without purpose, past empty streets, past closed shops, past streetlights flickering in the rain. Then she turned into the shortcut alley she took every night, and she saw a figure curled beneath the awning of a locked iron door. At first, Kira thought it was a pile of trash someone had thrown away. Then that pile of trash began to tremble. Hours before Kira Walsh saw the figure curled up in the dark alley, more than 20 kilometers south of Chicago, Barrett Gallagher was sitting in a windowless room in the basement of his own house. Across from him sat Donnelly, a 40-year-old man with a gray, bloodless face, sweat sliding down his temples even though the room wasn't hot. Donnelly had followed Barrett for 11 years. 11 years of eating at the table of the Gallagher organization, of being protected beneath the name Barrett Gallagher, of being trusted with information only the inner circle knew. And last week, Briggs discovered that Donnelly had sold the warehouse list to a rival on the north side. Barrett didn't yell. He didn't slam the table. He didn't stand up. He sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the tabletop, watching Donnelly tremble as he tried to explain. Donnelly talked a great deal. He talked about hardship, about being forced, about how it had only happened one time. Barrett let him say everything. Barrett's silence was heavier than any shout could have been. When Donnelly finally stopped, when he had run out of words to defend himself, Barrett opened his mouth. His voice was flat, neither rising nor falling, as if he were reading a contract. You have a life in this city, a house, a job, everything you've built over the past 11 years. I'm giving you 24 hours to take it all somewhere else. Donnelly opened his mouth, about to say more. Barrett looked straight into his eyes. Just looked. Donnelly closed his mouth, stood up, and walked out of the room. Before midnight that night, Donnelly had vanished from Chicago. No one asked where he had gone. In Barrett Gallagher's world, when he said 24 hours, everyone understood it wasn't a suggestion. It was the lightest final sentence they could ever hope to receive. Barrett Gallagher was 33 years old, and he ran the Gallagher Syndicate, an underworld empire that controlled most of the business activity on the south side of Chicago. Some of it was legal, some of it wasn't. He wasn't the kind of crime boss people saw in movies. He didn't wear gold rings, didn't smoke cigars, didn't sit in leather chairs saying philosophical things. Barrett was the kind of man who could step into a room without saying a word, and everyone would instinctively sit up straighter. He spoke little. Every sentence he said had already been weighed, and every sentence carried weight. 15 years in the underworld had taught him that people who talked too much were people without real power. Real power lived in silence. After Donnelly left, Barrett sat alone in the room. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it slowly, then set the glass down. The door opened. Briggs walked in. Briggs was 38 years old, had followed Barrett for 12 years, and was the right hand Barrett trusted most. He never said more than necessary. He never asked more than he was allowed. That was why he was still alive, and still standing in that position. Zoe is still fine, Briggs said. Still working the evening shift at the bar on Halsted Street. Gets off at 11 o'clock. Back to her rented room by 11:30. Still no contact. Barrett nodded. 3 months. 3 months since his sister had thrown her keys onto the table and walked out through that door. 3 months since Zoe had stopped answering his calls, stopped replying to his messages, stopped wanting to see his face. Barrett had sent men to follow Zoe during the first week. Zoe found out, and her reaction was even fiercer than the night she left home. Barrett pulled his men back. He kept only one thing in place. From time to time, Briggs drove past the bar, looked through the glass to see whether his sister was still there, and reported back. That was all Barrett allowed himself to do. He could have bought the entire street where Zoe lived. He could have sent 10 men to guard her 24 hours a day. He could have forced her home with one phone call. But his mother, before she died 5 years ago, had held his hand and said, "Protect your sister at any cost, but don't cage her." Barrett had managed the first half. The second half, he was still learning. He sat in his study, looking at his phone. Zoe's number was right at the top of his contacts. He opened the messages and reread the last line he had sent 3 weeks earlier. "I'm still here." No answer. Like every other time, Barrett set the phone down, turned off the desk lamp, and leaned back in his chair. Tonight was like every other night. Donnelly was gone. A traitor had been dealt with. The organization was still running smoothly, and he was still sitting here alone, in a house too large for a man whose family refused to stay. Then the phone vibrated. Deep into the night. An unknown number. To understand why Zoe Gallagher was curled up in that dark alley in the rain that night, we have to go back 3 months. Zoe was 19, the only younger sister of Barrett Gallagher. She grew up in the sprawling house on the south side, where there was always someone guarding the door, always a black car parked out front, and always someone following her whenever she stepped outside. Barrett loved his sister in the only way he knew how, through control. He chose Zoe's school. He approved Zoe's friends. He planted people to watch her whenever she went anywhere for more than 2 hours. To Barrett, that was protection. To Zoe, it was a prison. The final argument happened on a Saturday night, right in the middle of the living room. Zoe said, "I'm not someone you lock inside a house just so you can sleep peacefully every night." Barrett said, "I'm protecting you." Zoe said, "You're protecting yourself. You're afraid of losing me the way you lost Mom, so you lock me away. But I'm not Mom, and I won't die just because you can't see me." That sentence struck the deepest wound. Barrett went silent, and Barrett Gallagher's silence, as everyone knew, was never a good sign. But this time, he wasn't silent because he was angry. He was silent because he didn't know what to say. Zoe left that night. She threw the house keys onto the table, pulled a small suitcase behind her, called a taxi, and disappeared. She blocked Barrett's number, blocked Briggs's number, blocked every number she knew belonged to the Gallagher organization. She rented a small room in Logan Square, applied for a bartending job at a bar on Halsted Street, and began the first independent life she had ever had. Barrett sent 2 men to follow her. Zoe found out during the first week. She called from a friend's number and said only one sentence. "Pull your men back, or I'll disappear for real, and this time you won't find me." Barrett pulled his men back. He kept only Briggs, who would sometimes drive past the bar, look from a distance, and report back. Tonight, Briggs wasn't anywhere near Zoe. He was on the south side of the city, dealing with the aftermath of the Donnelly matter, making sure no trace had been left behind. That gap was exactly when Troy Mercer stepped in. Troy Mercer was 30 years old, the son of Hugh Mercer, a real estate magnate on the north side of Chicago. The Mercer family and the Gallagher family weren't friends. They had been fighting over the southern parcel of land for more than a year, a deal worth millions of dollars, and neither side was willing to step back. Troy knew Zoe was Barrett's sister. He had known since the first week she walked into the bar. Troy didn't come by chance. He came with a purpose. Troy flirted with Zoe for 3 weeks. He came to the bar every Friday night, sat at the exact part of the counter where Zoe mixed drinks, ordered exactly what Zoe recommended, smiled at the right moments, asked the right questions. Troy was handsome, polished in his speech, and knew how to make a 19-year-old girl, lonely in a big city, feel cared for. Zoe wasn't stupid. She had grown up in the Gallagher family. She knew how to read people. But she was also 19, and she wanted someone to look at her without thinking about her brother. She wanted one normal evening, like any other normal girl. So when Troy invited her to a friend's birthday party in the suburbs that night, Zoe agreed. She got into Troy's car at 11 o'clock at night, after her shift ended. The rain had already begun to fall. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. Troy played music, told funny stories, drove west. Then he turned onto an empty road, surrounded by warehouses and closed workshops. Zoe recognized it at once. The instinct Barrett had taught her since she was little came alive immediately. "This isn't the way to the party," Zoe said. Troy stopped smiling. His face changed. The smile vanished, and in its place came a cold, calculating look Zoe had never seen before. "Call your brother," Troy said. "Tell him the southern parcel doesn't belong to Gallagher. Say those exact words." Zoe understood immediately. It wasn't chance. It wasn't affection. Everything had been calculated. Over the past 3 weeks, every smile, every question, every drink Troy had bought her, all of it had been a move in a chess game where she was the pawn. "No," Zoe said. Her voice didn't shake. "Call him." "No." Troy looked at her. Then he reached over and took the phone from the pocket of Zoe's jacket. He took her wallet, too. Then he opened the car door on Zoe's side. "Get out." Zoe looked out through the car door. An abandoned industrial district. Midnight. Pouring rain. Not a single person in sight. She looked back at Troy. "You're leaving me here? You can walk home. It'll probably only take a few hours." Troy leaned across her and pushed the door wider. Or next time, when I ask, you'll call. Zoe stepped out of the car. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't say another word. She was Barrett Gallagher's sister. She wouldn't let anyone see her collapse. Troy's car sped away, its taillights fading into the curtain of rain. Zoe stood in the middle of the road, soaked through, with no phone, no money, and no idea where she was. She started walking. The rain grew heavier and heavier. The wind came in bitter gusts that cut through the thin layer of her clothes. Zoe found an awning in front of a locked iron door in the alley between two warehouses, and she sat down beneath it. She pulled both knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms tightly around herself. Her lips began to turn purple. Her hands began to lose feeling. She didn't know how long she sat there. Maybe 1 hour, maybe 2 hours. The rain didn't stop, and Zoe began to think that maybe she had been wrong to leave home. Maybe Barrett had been right. Maybe the world outside the doors of the Gallagher house was more dangerous than she had imagined. Then she heard footsteps. Someone was walking through the alley, coming toward her. A blurred figure in the rain, thin and small. A scarf wrapped around her neck, wearing a soaked cleaning uniform. The person stopped, looked down at Zoe, and knelt beside her. Kira pulled Zoe's arm over her shoulder and began to walk. The strange girl was heavier than Kira had expected, or perhaps Kira herself was more exhausted than she realized. The rain was still pouring. The wind blew straight into Kira's chest, her thin cleaning uniform clinging to her skin. So cold she had to clench her teeth to keep from trembling. Her neck was bare now. The place where the wool scarf had just been wrapped was left with nothing but rain and wind. But Kira didn't think about that. She thought about placing one foot in front of the other, keeping the strange girl upright, and finding somewhere, anywhere, with light. Phone, the girl stammered, her voice shaking so badly it almost wasn't a voice anymore. He took everything. I know. Don't talk anymore. Save your strength and walk. Kira pulled Zoe closer against her, trying to share the little warmth she still had left. She looked around. An abandoned industrial district, all closed warehouses, not a single person in sight. But in the distance, at the end of the road, Kira saw light, a gas station. She dragged Zoe toward it. Every step seemed to stretch twice as long. The rain didn't ease. The wind didn't stop. Kira bit her lip and kept walking. 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. Kira didn't count. She only knew that when the two of them staggered through the door of the gas station, the night clerk looked up with wide, stunned eyes. 2 women soaked through, one with purple lips wrapped in an old wool scarf, the other in a cleaning uniform, shivering violently, water pooling beneath their feet. "Let me use the phone," Kira said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. The gas station clerk handed over the phone without asking anything. Kira set Zoe down on a plastic chair inside, pulled the wool scarf tighter around the girl's shoulders, then turned to ask, "Is there anyone I can call? Any number you remember?" Zoe looked at Kira with cloudy eyes. She was mumbling, her consciousness drifting in and out. But then she recited a string of numbers, slowly, one number at a time. Kira dialed, then lifted the phone to her ear. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times, more than 20 kilometers away. In the meeting room on the ground floor of Barrett Gallagher's house, 6 men were sitting around an oak table. They were the 6 most powerful men on the south side of Chicago, the men who controlled every street, every shop, every deal inside their territory. They had come here tonight to discuss the southern parcel, the deal the Mercer family was fighting over. Barrett sat at the head of the table, listening, saying nothing. He let them present, argue, propose. He hadn't made any decision yet. Then his phone vibrated, deep into the night. An unknown number. Barrett never answered unknown numbers in the middle of a meeting. But tonight, something made him pick up. Maybe instinct. Maybe the intuition of a man who had already lost his mother and was afraid of losing his sister too. He answered, "Your sister is safe," a woman's voice. Calm, brief, not shaking. "Someone left her in the middle of an industrial district. I found her in an alley and brought her to the gas station at the corner of Ashland and 47th. She needs care." Barrett stood up. The 6 men around the table stopped speaking. "The meeting is over." Barrett's voice was flat, as it always was. But Briggs, who had just stepped into the room, heard something in it that in 12 years of following Barrett, he had never heard before. A partner sitting closest to him, the man who ran Englewood, opened his mouth. "We're in the middle of a $10 million deal." Barrett looked at him. Just looked. The man who ran Englewood, a man who had never blinked in front of any opponent, sat back down and didn't say another word. Barrett walked out of the room. He called to Briggs. 2 cars. Ashland and 47th. Right now. Briggs didn't ask why. He didn't ask what had happened. He pulled out his phone, made 2 calls, and within 3 minutes, 2 black cars had started in the parking lot. Barrett slid into the back seat of the first car. The door closed. The car tore away into the rainy night. And across the city, inside the brightly lit gas station in the middle of the abandoned industrial district, Kira Walsh set the phone down, sat beside the strange girl, and waited. She didn't know who she had just called. She didn't know the man on the other end of the line had just abandoned a $10 million deal to rush there. She didn't know that the 15-second phone call had just tied 2 completely different worlds together. She only knew that the girl beside her was shaking, and she needed to keep her awake until someone came. 2 black cars stopped in front of the gas station not long after the call. Barrett opened the car door before the wheels had fully stopped. The rain was still pouring. The wind was still lashing, but he felt nothing except the pounding of his own heart in his chest as he stepped through the glass door of the gas station. He saw Zoe immediately. His sister was sitting on a white plastic chair set close against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest, wrapped in an old wool scarf. The scarf was a faded silvery gray, patched in 2 places with yarn of another color, the wool worn so thin in some spots that light could almost pass through it. It wasn't Zoe's scarf. Barrett knew that because he knew everything his sister owned. That scarf belonged to someone else, the person sitting beside Zoe. A thin, small woman, wearing a dark blue cleaning uniform soaked through and clinging to her body. Black hair stuck to her face, bare neck, pallid lips, shivering in waves, but still sitting straight. One hand resting on Zoe's shoulder to keep the girl from collapsing. Barrett went straight to Zoe. He knelt in front of his sister, both hands gripping her shoulders. "Zoe." 1 word. Only 1 word, but for the first time in many years, his voice wasn't flat. Zoe lifted her head. She saw her brother, and the dam broke. She collapsed against Barrett's chest and cried. Not a small cry. It was the cry of a 19-year-old girl who had tried to be strong for 3 months, who had tried to prove she could stand on her own, and who tonight had realized that the world outside was crueler than she had imagined. Barrett held his sister, tightly. He said nothing. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask who had done this. Those questions could wait. Right now, he simply held his sister and let her cry. While Zoe cried on Barrett's shoulder, Kira stood up. Quietly, she stepped back a few paces, leaned against the gas station counter, and watched the brother and sister hold each other. She didn't know who the man who had just walked in was. She didn't know how much power he had. She only saw a brother holding his sister in the middle of a rainy night, and that was enough for her to know the other girl would be all right. Barrett lifted his head from Zoe's shoulder. For the first time, he looked directly at Kira. He looked at her bare neck, where the scarf had been wrapped. He looked at the thin uniform soaked through. He looked at her pale lips, the uncontrollable tremor in her shoulders. Then he looked back at the wool scarf around Zoe's shoulders. Old, frayed, patched, but warm, and he understood. No one needed to explain it to him. This woman had taken off the only thing keeping her warm, something that clearly wasn't disposable because it had been carefully repaired, preserved, wrapped around her neck every night, and given it to a complete stranger. Barrett registered that, not with words. With the way he looked at Kira for 3 more seconds before turning back to care for Zoe. Those 3 seconds were enough for Barrett Gallagher, a man who never owed anyone anything, to realize he had just incurred a debt that couldn't be repaid with money. He helped Zoe stand, then guided his sister out to the car. Zoe needed to go to the hospital. That was the priority. Barrett settled Zoe into the back seat, pulled a blanket from the trunk and wrapped it around his sister, then turned back toward the gas station. Kira was no longer there. He looked through the glass door. Kira's figure was walking in the rain. A few dozen meters from the gas station, heading toward the dark road. Bare neck, thin shirt, on foot. Barrett stepped out into the rain and called loudly, "Ma'am." Kira stopped, turned her back. "She's fine now. I can get home." Then she turned away and kept walking. She didn't wait for him to answer. Didn't ask who he was. Didn't ask for anything. Didn't demand anything. She simply left. as if what she had just done was the most ordinary thing in the world. Barrett stood in the rain, watching Kira's figure grow smaller. He had to get into the car. Zoe was waiting. The hospital was waiting. He couldn't stand there, but he also couldn't let that woman disappear into the rainy night as though she had never existed. Barrett turned to Briggs. "Follow her. Don't let her disappear." Briggs nodded and moved quickly into the second car. Barrett got into the car with Zoe. The car tore off toward the hospital. Inside the car, Barrett looked at the wool scarf still wrapped around Zoe's shoulders. Old yarn, the smell of rain, the smell of sweat, and something very faint that he couldn't name. That woman's scarf. The only thing she had, and she had given it away. 10 minutes later, Briggs called. Found her. About 300 meters from the gas station. Sitting against a wall beneath the awning of a closed shop. Exhausted, but still conscious. She won't get in the car. Barrett closed his eyes. Get her to the hospital, by any means. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Briggs said, "Understood." Barrett didn't know what Briggs said to convince Kira to get into the car. He didn't ask. He only knew that 20 minutes later, while he was sitting beside Zoe's bed in the emergency room, Briggs sent a text. Her name is Kira Walsh, room 312, 3rd floor. Exhaustion and mild hypothermia. Stable. Barrett read the message. Kira Walsh. He repeated the name in his mind. The cleaning woman who had taken off her only wool scarf in the cold rain to cover a complete stranger, then walked back into the dark, as though her own life wasn't worth as much as the last thread of warmth she had left. Barrett Gallagher had met every kind of person in 15 years. People loyal because of money. People loyal because of fear. But someone who gave everything when she had nothing herself. He had never met anyone like that before. Kira opened her eyes and didn't recognize where she was. A white ceiling, fluorescent lights, the steady beeping of a heart monitor beside her ear. She was lying in a hospital bed, wearing a patient gown someone had changed her into, an IV needle inserted into her left hand. She didn't remember how she had gotten here. The last thing she remembered was sitting against a wall somewhere, the rain still falling, and a man's voice saying something she couldn't quite hear. Then everything went dark. Kira turned her head and looked around the room. White bed, white bedside table. Nothing of hers was here. No backpack, no uniform, and no wool scarf. Her heart tightened. She called the nurse. A middle-aged woman stepped in, wearing a professional smile. "Your belongings are being kept safely in storage. Don't worry." "The wool scarf," Kira said. "The gray wool scarf, patched in 2 places. Where is it?" The nurse nodded, said she would check, then walked out. Kira lay back and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the scarf, thought about the girl in the alley, thought about the phone call at the gas station. Then, she thought about the most practical thing of all. She had no insurance, no money to pay the hospital bill, and had just missed another shift. The door opened. It wasn't the nurse. A man stood on the threshold, tall, wearing a black shirt, holding something neatly folded in his hand. She recognized him as the man from the gas station. The man who had held the girl. The man who had called out Zoe's name. Barrett Gallagher stepped into the room, but he didn't sit down. He stood a few steps from Kira's bed, close enough to speak, far enough not to intrude. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Zoe is all right. Downstairs. Sleeping." Kira nodded. "Good." Silence. Barrett was the one who broke it first. "You saved my sister. I want to repay you." "I don't need anyone owing me," Kira said. Her voice wasn't cold, wasn't angry, only flat, as if she were stating a fact. "I'm not talking about debt," Barrett replied. "I'm talking about the truth. You gave away the only thing you had in the middle of a rainy night to cover someone you'd never met. Not everyone would do that. Anyone would. No, not everyone would. I know that because I live in a world where people calculate before giving away anything." Kira didn't answer. She looked at what Barrett was holding. Barrett stepped closer and placed it on the bedside table. The wool scarf. It had been dried, folded neatly, the old yarn still soft. Someone had washed it by hand, carefully, without loosening the patched places. "Thank you," Kira said softly. Barrett nodded. Then he turned and walked out of the room without saying anything more. The door closed. Kira lay still for a while. Then she reached for the scarf and pressed it to her face. The familiar wool touched her skin. There was a faint smell of soap, but underneath it, the scent of old wool was still there. Her mother's scent. the scent of that final winter. She closed her eyes. 2 days later, Kira was discharged from the hospital. Barrett had paid the entire hospital bill, something she didn't know until she reached the front desk and was told everything had already been settled. She wanted to be angry, but she didn't have the energy to be angry. She was taken to a hotel near the hospital, a clean, warm room with hot water. Barrett had arranged it. Briggs handed her the key. Kira accepted because she had nowhere else to go. Her car was still broken, and her studio apartment was half a city away. She stayed there one night. The next morning, Zoe knocked on her door. The girl looked much better, with a little color in her cheeks and brighter eyes than she had that night. Zoe handed Kira a small paper bag with bread and hot coffee inside, and the two of them sat down and talked for the first time. Briefly, but long enough for Zoe to look at Kira and say, "My brother is going to find the person who left me on that road. He's always like that." Kira didn't answer. That afternoon, Kira was sitting in the hotel room when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She opened the door and looked out. Barrett was walking down the corridor in a black suit, Briggs a step behind him. The two men moved quickly, with purpose. Barrett saw Kira standing in her doorway. He stopped. "Are you going to deal with the person who left her on that road?" Kira asked. Barrett didn't answer, but his silence was already an answer. Kira looked at him. Then she said, her voice quiet but clear with every word, "Don't do anything that makes your sister see her brother as someone frightening." Barrett stood still. 15 years in Chicago's underworld, and he had heard thousands of people say all kinds of things to him. Flattery, begging, threats, challenges, but no one had ever spoken to him the way Kira just had. Not out of fear, not because she wanted something. Only because it was true. The cleaning woman, with no power, no money, no idea who he was, had just said straight to his face what not a single person in the Gallagher organization would dare open their mouth to say. Barrett looked at Kira. Then he gave one nod, just one, and walked away. In the elevator, Briggs stayed silent for a while, then looked at Barrett. Barrett didn't look back. He only stood there, watching the floor numbers change on the panel, and thought about Kira's words. "Don't do anything that makes your sister see her brother as someone frightening." The black car was already running outside the hotel lobby. Barrett got in. Briggs sat beside him. The car sped away, and Kira Walsh's words stayed with him all the way to Mercer Tower. The next morning, Barrett Gallagher came to Mercer Tower. Not at 2 o'clock in the morning, when there was only Kira and the empty hallways, but at 9 o'clock in the morning, in broad daylight, when the 40-story building was operating at full capacity. 3 people walked into the lobby: Barrett, Zoe, and Briggs. Only 3 people. The receptionist looked up, about to ask a question, but Briggs simply placed a business card on the counter and said, "Mr. Gallagher is here to see Mr. Hugh Mercer." The business card had no phone number, no email address, only one name: Barrett Gallagher. The receptionist looked at the card, looked at the 3 of them, then picked up the phone and called upstairs without asking another question. On the 28th floor, Hugh Mercer was standing by the window. He looked down at the parking lot in front of the building. 4 black cars were parked tightly in one corner, and beside each car stood a man with his arms crossed over his chest, his face expressionless. Hugh Mercer was 62 years old, and he had spent 30 years building a real estate empire. He wasn't a man who panicked easily, but he knew who Barrett Gallagher was. All of Chicago knew. And when Barrett Gallagher personally came to his building, bringing his sister with him, with 4 black cars parked outside, Hugh understood this wasn't a social visit. The meeting room door opened. Barrett walked in first, Zoe behind him, Briggs standing at the door. Hugh Mercer sat at the head of the table. Troy Mercer sat beside his father, his face trying to hold on to calm, but both hands clenched tightly on his thighs. Barrett pulled out the chair across from Hugh and sat down, as calmly as if he were taking a seat at breakfast. He didn't hurry. He looked at Hugh, looked at Troy, looked once around the meeting room, then he began to speak. His voice did not rise, did not fall, flat as the surface of a lake before a storm. Mercer Tower, 40 floors. Estimated value, $270 million. Remaining bank debt, $93 million. The lease contracts for floors 15 through 20 expire in 6 months, and no tenant has renewed yet. The southern parcel you're fighting me for. You've placed a $4 million deposit, but you still don't have enough capital to develop it. You're waiting for a loan from Continental Bank, but your file contains a few numbers the bank doesn't know about. With every sentence Barrett spoke, Hugh Mercer's face turned another shade paler. Those were pieces of information Hugh believed only he and his chief accountant knew. Barrett knew everything. Every number, every contract, every debt. And he spoke them aloud in Hugh's own meeting room, as if he were reading from a restaurant menu. Then Barrett turned to Troy. For the first time, he looked directly into the face of Hugh Mercer's son. Your son approached my sister for 3 weeks, played the good man, invited her into his car. Then, when she refused to do what he wanted, he took her phone, took her wallet, and abandoned a 19-year-old girl in an empty industrial district at midnight, in the rain. Troy opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to deny. Barrett looked at Troy. Just looked, and Troy Mercer, 30 years old, the son of a tycoon, a man who had never had to bow his head to anyone, shut his mouth halfway through without making a single sound. Then Zoe stood up. She had sat silent from the moment she entered the room. Barrett didn't tell her to speak. He didn't signal to her. Zoe stood on her own, walked to stand in front of Troy on her own, and spoke on her own. That night, I sat in an alley between 2 warehouses for 2 hours. No phone, no money. Rain pouring down on my head, and I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. I thought I wasn't going to make it through that night. Zoe spoke slowly, each word clear, looking straight into Troy's eyes without blinking. And the person who saved me wasn't someone with money or power. It wasn't my brother. It wasn't anyone in my family. It was a woman who cleans this building every night. She passed by, saw me, knelt down, took off the only wool scarf she had on her body, wrapped it around me, then helped me walk through the rain with her own neck bare and freezing. She didn't know who I was. She didn't care who I was. She only saw someone who needed help, and she gave everything. Zoe stopped. And you have everything. A beautiful car, money, a high house with wide doors, and you chose to leave me behind. Troy said nothing. He couldn't say anything. Hugh Mercer was silent too. Barrett let Zoe finish. Then he turned back to Hugh, his voice still as flat as it had been from the beginning. Here are the conditions. A public apology. Compensation. 200 hours of charity work for your son, and you withdraw from the southern parcel. Hugh opened his mouth. That deal is, or the second way, Barrett cut in, his voice not changing by even half a tone. You know my way. The meeting room went silent. Hugh looked at Barrett. Looked at the 4 black cars outside the window. Looked at his son with his head lowered. Then he nodded. Barrett stood up. He walked to the door, stopped, turned to look at Hugh one last time. You should teach your son. Because next time, I won't come here to talk. Then he walked out, with Zoe and Briggs following behind him. In the car home, Zoe sat silently, looking out the window. The rain had stopped, and the sun was rising. After a long while, she said softly, "Thank you." Barrett looked at his sister. "You don't need to thank me. You spoke for yourself." Zoe smiled for the first time since that night. That afternoon, Barrett returned to the hotel. Kira was sitting on the bed, her backpack already packed, the wool scarf wrapped around her neck. She was getting ready to leave. Barrett stood in the doorway. "I want you to stay at my house. Not forever, but long enough for you to get steady." "I have a home," Kira said. "I have a job. You know the building you clean every night?" Barrett said. "Mercer Tower. You mop the floors for the man who left my sister on the road. Every night, you walk through those hallways, and not one person in that building sees you." Kira was silent. Barrett continued, his voice softer. "I see you." 4 words. Kira took her backpack, stood up, and followed Barrett out to the car. She said nothing more, made no promise to stay long. She simply went. When the car stopped in front of Barrett's house on the south side, Kira stepped out and looked at the sprawling house where she didn't belong. The front door opened. Zoe stood there, waiting for her, smiling. 3 months had passed since Kira stepped into Barrett Gallagher's house. 3 months living in a house larger than the entire apartment building, where her old studio sat on the 3rd floor. Months spent sleeping in the biggest bed she had ever lain in a room with windows overlooking the back garden, with a fireplace, with as much hot water as she wanted. But Kira Walsh was still Kira Walsh. She still worked the night shift as a cleaner, not at Mercer Tower anymore. Barrett had made it clear she didn't need to go back there, and this time she agreed, because she didn't want to mop another floor for the Mercers either. She applied for a job in another office building in the West Loop, a shift from 6 o'clock in the evening to 2 o'clock in the morning. The same schedule, the same work, the same pay. Every month, she left an envelope of money on the kitchen table. Rent money. Barrett looked at the envelope, didn't open it, didn't say a word. The next morning, the envelope was still there. Kira placed the next month's envelope beside it. Barrett still didn't touch it. It was a silent war between the two most stubborn people in Chicago, and neither one was willing to lose. Zoe and Kira began to grow close in the most natural way, not because anyone forced them to, but because every night when Kira went to work, Zoe texted, "Are you home yet?" And every night when Kira finished her shift, she answered, "Yes." 2 words, but steady. That was how two women used to living alone began caring about each other without needing to say it out loud. Then, one Saturday afternoon, everything changed. Kira was in the kitchen pouring water when the gate bell rang. The security camera showed a man standing outside the gate. Thin, his back slightly bent, gray hair in a messy tangle, wrinkled clothes, and even through the camera, Kira recognized him immediately. Her father. 10 years. 10 years since the morning Kira had woken up, and he was no longer there. 10 years without a phone call, without a message, without one word of explanation. And now he was standing here, in front of Barrett Gallagher's house, reeking of alcohol, staring into the camera with bloodshot eyes. Kira set the glass of water down. She went out to the gate. Barrett was in his study on the 2nd floor. He saw everything through the camera screen, but he didn't move. Not yet. Kira opened the gate. Her father stood there, the smell of liquor so strong she had to hold her breath for a second. He looked Kira up and down, looked at the house behind her, looked at the black car parked in the yard. Then he laughed. A low, crooked, broken laugh with no joy in it at all. "So now you're clinging to a rich man? Just like your mother?" Kira said nothing. She stood there, her hands at her sides, her face without expression. Inside, everything was breaking. But outside, she didn't let him see a single crack. Her father went on, "I heard people say my daughter is living with some Southside boss. I thought you were smarter than that. Turns out you're all the same. The women in our family. The second you see money, you forget your self-respect." Kira still didn't speak. She looked at her father, the man who, 10 years ago, had carried her on his shoulders to buy ice cream every Sunday afternoon, the man who had sat beside her mother's bed through the nights when she was in pain, the man who had once been everything and then one day had become nothing at all. She wanted to say so much. She wanted to ask why he had left. She wanted to ask where he had been for the past 10 years, when she drank warm water instead of eating dinner, when she walked home at 2 o'clock in the morning, when she mopped other people's floors to pay rent for a room with no heat. But she said nothing, because she knew asking wouldn't change anything. Then the door behind Kira opened. Barrett stepped out and stood beside her. He didn't say a word. Didn't look at Kira's father. Didn't threaten him. He simply stood there, beside Kira, half a step away from her, both hands in his trouser pockets. Barrett Gallagher's presence said more than any words could have. Kira's father looked at Barrett. He knew. No one needed to introduce him. The way he stood, the look in his eyes, and the 4 security cameras pointed straight at his face, all of it said that the man standing beside his daughter was not someone to joke with. Kira's father stepped back once, then twice. Then he turned around and left without saying another word. Kira stood watching her father's figure grow smaller at the end of the road. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears for that man long ago, but not crying didn't mean it didn't hurt. Barrett turned back into the house. Kira stood there a little longer, then went inside too. Neither of them said anything for the rest of the afternoon. That night, Kira didn't go to work. For the first time in many years, she missed a shift without being sick. She sat on the back porch, staring into the dark, hugging her knees. Barrett stepped out close to 11 o'clock at night. He was holding 2 cups. He placed 1 cup of warm water beside Kira, then sat down in the chair next to her. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't say, "I understand." He just sat there. The 2 of them stayed silent for a very long time. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 10 minutes. Crickets sang in the garden. The wind moved softly. Then Kira spoke, her voice so quiet Barrett had to lean closer to hear her. "He wasn't always like that. When my mother was still alive, he used to be a good man. He used to carry me to buy ice cream every Sunday. He used to sit and knit with my mother every winter night." Barrett looked at Kira. "Good men don't abandon their daughters." Kira turned to look at him. Her eyes weren't angry, weren't sad, only filled with a deep understanding people only have after they've hurt long enough. Sometimes people aren't strong enough to stay good forever. My mother died, and he lost the best part of himself with her. It wasn't that he wanted to become that way. He just didn't know how to live without her. Barrett was silent. He thought about the way he had handled Donnelly, thought about the way he had confronted Hugh Mercer, thought about 15 years in the underworld, where he had been taught that weakness was a crime and forgiveness was stupidity. Then he looked at the woman sitting beside him, the woman abandoned by her father, battered by life, and still able to find a reason to understand instead of hate. He said quietly, "You're stronger than I am, Kira." Kira looked at him. Then she shook her head gently. "No, I'm just more used to pain than you are." They sat on the porch until the cups of water had gone completely cold. Neither one said anything more, but that night, Barrett Gallagher saw the world a little differently. Not much, just a little, enough to change everything. The next 2 months passed, and Barrett Gallagher's house began to have sounds it had never had before. The sound of Zoe laughing in the kitchen when she cooked and burned something for the 3rd time that week. The sound of Kira opening the door at 2 o'clock in the morning, stepping lightly through the hallway so she wouldn't wake anyone. The sound of cups touching cups each morning when the 3 of them sat around the dining table, not saying much, but all of them there. Kira still worked the night shift as a cleaner, a new building in the West Loop. The old shift, the old pay. Every evening, she put on her uniform, wrapped the wool scarf around her neck, and stepped out the door. Every morning, she came home, changed her clothes, then went down to the kitchen to make coffee before Zoe woke up. The rent envelope still appeared on the kitchen table at the beginning of every month. Barrett still didn't touch it. As time went on, the envelopes began to line up beside one another on the table. No one mentioned them. One evening, before Kira left for work, Zoe sat on the front steps, holding a cup of tea in both hands. Kira came out, saw Zoe, and stopped. "Why do you still go mop floors?" Zoe asked, her voice carrying no judgment, only real curiosity. "You know Barrett could get you a job 10 times better with one phone call, right?" "Right," Kira said. "Then why do you still go?" Kira looked at Zoe. The 19-year-old girl sitting in front of her was far from the trembling girl with purple lips in the dark alley that night. There was color in her cheeks now. Her eyes had brightened again, but inside those eyes, there was still something Kira recognized at once, because she saw it every day in the mirror too, the need to prove she could stand on her own. "Because it's work I got for myself," Kira said. "No one gave it to me. No one can take it away. It's mine." Zoe was silent for a while. Then she said, her voice softer, "I left home for that reason too. I wanted something that was mine, not Barrett's. Not because I'm Gallagher's sister, just mine." Kira looked at Zoe. Then she smiled, the first time Zoe had seen Kira smile since the 2 of them had known each other. "Then you understand." Zoe smiled too. No further explanation was needed. 2 women from 2 completely different worlds. One raised in the house of a boss, one raised in an empty home, but both carrying the same thing inside them, the need to stand on their own feet. That was the night Kira and Zoe truly became sisters. Not by blood, by understanding. Meanwhile, Barrett Gallagher had a new habit he told no one about. Every night, he sat in his study on the 2nd floor, reading files, signing papers, handling the things the Gallagher empire needed him to handle. The desk lamp cast a pale yellow glow, the door left slightly open, and he waited. Not for important news, not for Briggs's report. He waited for the sound of the front door opening at 2 o'clock in the morning, the sound of light footsteps crossing the 1st floor hallway, the sound of Kira's bedroom door closing softly. Every night, when he heard that sound, Barrett exhaled, turned off the light, and went to bed. He didn't come out to greet her. He didn't text to ask whether she was home. He didn't do anything at all. He only waited, listened, and breathed out. That was how Barrett Gallagher cared about someone when he didn't know how to say it out loud. 2 peaceful months. Zoe began learning about business, telling Barrett she wanted to open a coffee shop. Barrett didn't object. Kira began looking into management certificate courses, downloading free lectures onto her phone to listen to while she mopped floors. The house began to feel like a family. Not perfect, not like any family in the world, but warm, and sometimes warm was enough. But out there, someone didn't want this family to have peace. Hugh Mercer had lost the southern parcel. lost face before the business world, lost the control he had spent 30 years building. And he knew all of it had begun because of Barrett Gallagher. He also knew Barrett now had one more person in his house, a cleaning woman who walked home every night, with no bodyguards, no car service, a new weakness. On the first night, Kira realized someone was following her. She had just stepped out through the back door of the West Loop building at 2 o'clock in the morning, wrapped the wool scarf around her neck, and started walking toward the night bus stop as usual. When she saw them, 2 men were standing at the corner across the street. They weren't looking directly at her, but when she turned left, they turned left too. When she crossed the street, they crossed too. 10 years of walking home at 2 o'clock in the morning through neighborhoods no one wanted to walk through at night had taught Kira something no school ever could. Instinct. She knew when someone happened to be going the same way, and when someone was following her. Tonight was the second kind. Kira didn't panic. She turned into a convenience store that was still open, pretended to buy a bottle of water, and stood inside for 15 minutes, watching through the glass. The 2 men passed by and didn't stop. Kira waited another 5 minutes, then took a different route home. She thought it was petty thieves, something she had faced more than a few times in all those years of walking late through Bridgeport. She could handle it. She always handled it. So she didn't tell Barrett, didn't tell anyone. On the second night, Kira couldn't handle it. She stepped out through the back door of the West Loop building at 2 o'clock in the morning. A light rain was falling. The street was empty. She had just turned into the shortcut alley when a black van stopped right beside her. The van door opened. 2 men stepped out. They weren't petty thieves. These men were organized. They moved quickly, precisely, without saying a word. One blocked the way in front of her, the other behind her. Kira turned to run, but the man behind her had already grabbed her arm. She twisted away, but he was many times stronger than she was. They took her phone, forced her into the van, and the vehicle sped off. The whole thing happened in less than 30 seconds. The alley was empty again, as if nothing had ever happened. At 2:15 in the morning, Zoe Gallagher looked at her phone. Every night, when Kira finished her shift, she texted Zoe 2 words, "I'm home." Tonight, at 2:15, there was no message. Zoe waited until 2:30. Still nothing. She called Kira's phone. It rang, then went to voicemail. She called a second time. Voicemail. A third time. Voicemail. Zoe didn't wait for a fourth. She grabbed her car keys, put on her coat, and drove to the West Loop building where Kira worked. She arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning. The building was completely dark. She found the night security guard and asked about Kira. The guard said Kira had finished her shift at 2 o'clock and left through the back door as usual. Zoe ran to the back door. The alley was empty. She looked around and saw a security camera mounted on the wall of the building across the way. She went back inside and told the guard to show her the camera footage. The guard hesitated. Zoe said, her voice not shaking, but every word heavy as stone, "The cleaning woman who works here is named Kira Walsh. She's missing. Show me the camera footage, or I'll call my brother and he'll come here to watch it himself." "You don't want that." The guard opened the footage. Zoe looked at the screen. She saw Kira step out through the back door at 2 minutes past 2. Saw the black van stop. Saw the 2 men. Saw Kira being taken into the van. Zoe wrote down the van's license plate. Then she called Barrett. It was 3:15 in the morning. Barrett was sitting in his study. He was waiting for the sound of the front door opening, the sound of Kira's footsteps through the hallway. But tonight, that sound didn't come. Then his phone vibrated. Zoe. Kira was taken. Black van. License plate. Zoe read out the license plate, described the 2 men, described the time and location. Precise. Complete. Exactly the way Barrett had taught her when she was little, though she hadn't realized she still remembered. Barrett hung up. He set the phone down on the desk. Then he sat perfectly still. Briggs walked into the room 30 seconds later, because he always knew when Barrett needed him. Briggs looked at Barrett, and later he told the men in the organization, "I followed the boss for 12 years. I saw him angry many times, but that night, he wasn't angry. He was quiet, and that was when I was most afraid." Barrett picked up his phone and called a number. Hugh Mercer answered after the second ring, as if he had been waiting for this call. "Mr. Gallagher, I assume the cleaning girl didn't come home tonight. Perhaps we should talk again about the southern parcel." Barrett was silent for 3 seconds. Then he spoke, his voice neither rising nor falling, each word dropping like a stone into a deep well. You have 45 minutes to return my person. At the 46th minute, I won't call again. Hugh began. We should. Barrett hung up. He turned to Briggs and handed him the piece of paper with the license plate Zoe had texted. Trace it. Right now. Briggs didn't ask. He took out his phone and made 3 calls in a row. 28 minutes later, Briggs had an address. A warehouse in an industrial district on the west side of the city. Barrett stood up. The cars started. The convoy tore into the night. The room was small, with concrete walls, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and no windows. Kira sat on a wooden chair, her hands held tight behind her back with a plastic tie. 2 men guarded her, one standing beside the main door, the other sitting on a wooden crate in the corner. They didn't say anything to her. They didn't explain why she was there. They didn't ask her a single question. They only watched. Kira didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't ask. She had feared many things in her life. Hunger, cold, loneliness. But what she feared most was losing control. And the only way not to lose control now was to observe. She looked around the room. The main door was in front of her, locked from the outside. A side door was on the left, smaller, with an old lock, the kind with a latch from the inside. Concrete floor. No furniture except the chair she was sitting on, and a few wooden crates stacked in the corner. The light was weak, but enough for her to see everything clearly. She looked at the plastic tie wrapped around her wrists, not too tight. Whoever had tied it had done it in a hurry, not like a professional. Kira began to rotate her wrists. Slowly, very slowly. Not with a hard jerk, because jerking would make noise. She moved little by little, stretching the plastic tie, searching for the loose place. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. A gap began to open. The guard at the main door stepped outside, maybe to smoke, maybe to make a call. The other one sat on the wooden crate, his eyes fixed on his phone, the light from the screen washing over his face. He wasn't looking at Kira. She twisted harder. The plastic tie slipped past her knuckles. Her right hand came free, then her left. Kira sat still for another 10 seconds, breathing. Then she stood up, not rushing, not making a sound. She stepped to the left, toward the side door. Every footstep landed so lightly it almost didn't touch the floor. Her hand touched the latch. Old wood, rusted iron. She pulled the latch. A faint metallic scrape. The guard on the wooden crate looked up. His eyes left the phone at the exact moment Kira shoved the side door wide open and rushed outside. He shouted. But Kira was already running. The night was cold, the air damp. An open lot spread between the warehouses. Kira ran straight toward the distant streetlights, her feet striking the concrete, her lungs burning, but she didn't stop. Then she heard engines. Not from behind her, from ahead. Headlights flashed. 3 black cars came tearing in from the end of the road and stopped close to the open lot. The door of the first car opened. Barrett stepped out. He saw Kira running toward him, hair tangled, face pale, red marks around her wrists, but standing, running, escaping on her own 2 feet. Barrett stood still. He didn't rush toward her, didn't shout her name. He only stood there, beside the car, and waited for her to reach him. When Kira stopped in front of him, breathing hard, both hands braced on her knees, Barrett took off his suit jacket and placed it over her shoulders, gently, the way she had taken off her wool scarf and wrapped it around Zoe's shoulders in the dark alley many months before. No one spoke about that echo. There was no need. Let's go home, Barrett said. Kira lifted her head and looked at him. I don't need you to save me. I know, Barrett said, but I need to know you're safe. Barrett's men went into the warehouse to handle things. Kira got into the car. Barrett sat beside her. No one said anything the whole way home, but Barrett's jacket stayed on Kira's shoulders, and she didn't give it back. 4 days later, Kira sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. The red marks on her wrists had faded. She had been able to sleep, been able to eat, been able to breathe normally again. Barrett walked into the kitchen and poured coffee. He stood beside the counter, not sitting down. Kira looked at him. How far are you planning to take this? Far enough that he never dares look this way again. Then do it, Kira said, then added, but only to the right people. Barrett looked at her. He nodded. 1 week later, Barrett sat across from Hugh Mercer, in a room Hugh had not chosen and did not control. Only the 2 of them. No Briggs, no bodyguards. Barrett didn't need them. Hugh Mercer looked 10 years older than he had during their last meeting. He had lost the southern parcel, lost face before the business world, and now he was sitting here with the man he had made the mistake of choosing as an enemy. Barrett said, "I could end everything you have in one night. You know I could. I have enough to do it." Hugh didn't argue, because it was true, but I'm choosing another way. Barrett continued, "I want you to live. Live and watch everything you spent 30 years building collapse day by day. The building, the contracts, the reputation, all of it. And every day when you wake up and see one more thing disappear, you'll remember that it all began because you touched someone of mine." Barrett stood up. No handshake. No farewell. He walked out of the room as if leaving a meeting that didn't matter. Hugh Mercer remained sitting there alone, and he knew that everything Barrett had just said would happen, because Barrett Gallagher didn't make empty threats. 2 weeks later, federal authorities knocked on the Mercer family's door. Financial violations, illegal transactions, tax evasion. All the secrets Hugh thought he had buried deep were now lying on an investigator's desk. Hugh and Troy were both summoned. The Mercer empire began to collapse. Not in one night, slowly, piece by piece, exactly as Barrett had said. On the evening the authorities knocked on the Mercer family's door, Briggs sat in Barrett's study, reading the news on his phone. Barrett stood by the window, looking outside. "Sometimes the best revenge is letting your enemy bury himself," Barrett said, without turning around. Briggs nodded, though Barrett couldn't see him. In 12 years of following Barrett, Briggs had witnessed many ways he dealt with enemies. But this time was different. This time Barrett wasn't acting because of territory, money, or power. This time it was because of a cleaning woman he refused to admit had changed the way he saw everything. Barrett Gallagher had hidden the pain for many months, perhaps for many years. He didn't remember exactly when it had begun. He only knew that the pain in his stomach came more often, lasted longer, and each time struck harder than the last. It was the consequence of 15 years of relentless tension, meals abandoned because of meetings, sleepless nights because of deals, glasses of liquor swallowed during negotiations where there was no room for a man to refuse. Barrett didn't go to the doctor. A boss didn't go to the doctor. A boss didn't get sick. A boss didn't grow weak. That was the rule he had set for himself from the first day he sat in the chair everyone in the Gallagher organization had to look up to. So he swallowed painkillers, drank warm water, and kept going. Until the night he couldn't keep going anymore. That night, Kira was wearing her cleaning uniform, getting ready to leave for her shift. She wrapped the wool scarf around her neck, picked up her backpack, and stepped out of her room. As she passed Barrett's study on the second floor, she saw that the light was still on. Normally, she would have kept walking. Barrett always stayed up late, and she wasn't the kind of person who stepped into his business. But tonight, she heard a sound. Not a voice, not footsteps, the sound of something falling to the floor, heavy. Kira pushed open the study door. Barrett was lying on the floor beside his desk. The chair had tipped over. A glass of water had shattered on the floor. His face was deathly pale, sweat soaking his forehead, both hands clutching his stomach, his breathing sharp and uneven. Kira didn't panic. 10 years of living on her own, 10 years of facing all kinds of things at 2 o'clock in the morning, had taught her that panic didn't help anyone. She set her backpack down, knelt beside Barrett, and checked him. He was still conscious. His eyes were open, but clouded with pain. "Barrett," she called. "Listen to me. Lie on your side. Don't lie on your back." She turned Barrett onto his side, resting his head on his arm. Then she took out her phone and called emergency services. Her voice on the phone was so calm that the dispatcher might have thought this was an ordinary call. It wasn't. But Kira Walsh didn't allow her voice to shake. She never had. 15 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Barrett was taken away. Kira went with him. In the ambulance, Barrett held her hand. Not because it was romantic. Because he was in pain. Because he was hurting so badly that he needed something to hold on to. And Kira was the only thing there. She let him hold her. She said nothing. She only sat there. The hospital. The emergency room. The doctor said it was a severe stomach ulcer. Mild bleeding. Exhaustion. And he needed monitoring. Barrett was moved into a private room. Word spread quickly through the Gallagher organization. Within 1 hour, the hallway outside Barrett's room was full of people. Briggs stood closest to the door. Behind him were more than a dozen senior members, their faces tense, their voices lowered to whispers. When Barrett Gallagher was in the hospital, The entire south side held its breath. Zoe arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after Kira. She looked at the crowded hallway, looked at the worried faces, and understood immediately. If this news got out, their enemies would move. The organization couldn't go a single day without someone at the top. Zoe took out her phone and called Briggs into the hallway. "No one spreads this," she said, her voice steady, without hesitation. "My brother will be fine. Every operation stays on schedule. If anyone asks, say he's away on business for a few days." Briggs looked at Zoe, the stubborn 19-year-old girl who had left home 6 months earlier, the girl who had once shouted in Barrett's face that she wasn't someone to be locked away, was now standing in a hospital hallway, giving orders to the right hand of the Southside boss in a cold, calm voice exactly like her brother's. Briggs nodded. Understood. Then he turned back and informed the people in the hallway. The hospital room was quiet. The heart monitor beeped steadily. Barrett opened his eyes near dawn. The light in the room was dim. Someone had turned it down. He turned his head and looked around the room. Zoe wasn't here. She was out in the hallway handling everything. Briggs wasn't here either. He was making calls to make sure the organization kept running normally. There was only one person in the room. Kira sat in the chair in the corner, her back against the wall, both hands resting on her thighs. She was still wearing her cleaning uniform. The wool scarf was folded in her lap. She had been getting ready to go to work when Barrett collapsed. She hadn't changed clothes, hadn't gone home, hadn't gone anywhere. She had been sitting here since the ambulance arrived. "Where's Kira?" Barrett asked softly, his voice hoarse from the medicine. "I'm here," Kira said from the corner. Barrett turned toward her. "You need to sleep," Kira said. Barrett looked at the cleaning uniform she was wearing, looked at the scarf in her lap, looked at the clock on the wall. 5:15 in the morning. Kira's shift began at 6 o'clock in the evening and ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. She should have been at work many hours ago. "You didn't go to work?" Barrett asked. "I took tonight off," Kira said. 5 words. Barrett knew Kira Walsh had never missed a single shift since she had started working. Not because she was sick. Not because she was tired. Not because of storms. She went to work every night because that was her money, her freedom, the one thing she didn't allow anyone to take from her. And tonight, she had taken the night off. For him, Barrett said nothing more. He looked at Kira sitting in the corner, in her cleaning uniform, with the old wool scarf in her lap, and he closed his eyes. For the first time in 15 years, Barrett Gallagher allowed himself to be weak in front of another person, not because he wanted to, but because for the first time, someone stayed without needing him to be strong. 1 month after Barrett was discharged from the hospital, Zoe said she wanted to host a dinner. Not a big party, not an event, just dinner. Barrett looked at his sister and nodded. He didn't ask what the occasion was. He knew. On Saturday evening, the dining table in Barrett's house was set. Candles, white plates, and food Zoe had cooked herself. Zoe was 20 years old, had never cooked for more than 2 people, and tonight she was cooking for 7. The result was salmon burned on one side, roasted potatoes that weren't quite cooked through, salad that was fine because it didn't need cooking, and dessert that was a cake bought from a bakery because Zoe had given up on the homemade part at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. No one cared. 7 people sat around the table. Barrett at the head, Kira on his right, Zoe on his left, Briggs beside Zoe, and 3 trusted people in the organization whom Barrett trusted enough to invite into his home. This was the first time Barrett's house had ever held a family dinner. Not a meeting, not a negotiation, not people needing something from one another, just everyone sitting down, eating, and talking. Briggs told a story from when he first started following Barrett, back when Barrett was only 21, driving an old car he had bought on installments, and the first time he went to meet a partner. He got lost for 2 hours because he refused to ask anyone for directions. Barrett didn't deny it. He sat there listening, drinking water, and his face softened in a way the people around the table rarely ever got to see. Kira sat quietly and listened. She didn't tell any stories. She wasn't used to sitting at a dining table without having to stand up afterward to wash dishes or mop the floor. She wasn't used to having someone pour water for her. She was still learning how to sit there without feeling as if she were taking someone else's place. When the plates were nearly empty, and the conversation began to thin, Zoe stood up. She went into the kitchen and came back with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a strip of white cloth. She placed it in front of Kira. "What is this?" Kira asked. "Open it," Zoe said. Kira looked at Zoe, looked at Barrett. Neither of them said anything. She picked up the gift, pulled the cloth strip loose, and opened the brown paper. Inside was a wool scarf. New, thick, soft yarn. A warm gray color, not the cheap kind, but not so expensive that it would make Kira feel unworthy of it either. Zoe had chosen it very carefully. Kira lifted the scarf. Then she saw the words, embroidered in small letters on the inside corner of the scarf. White thread against gray wool. Handwritten, imperfect, slightly uneven in places, clearly stitched by Zoe herself, rather than ordered from a shop. 5 words. For the one who gave everything. Kira, read the words, then read them again, then read them a third time. The dining table went silent. Briggs looked down at his plate. The 3 trusted men looked away. Barrett looked at Kira, and Kira Walsh, the 27-year-old woman who had raised herself since she was 17, who had walked home at 2 o'clock in the morning for 10 years without crying once, who had been abandoned by her father and stood there enduring it without shedding a tear, who had been taken in the middle of the night and never begged, who had sat beside Barrett's hospital bed all night without letting her face change. That woman began to cry, not sobbing, not wailing. Tears ran down her cheeks, silent and steady, as if something held tight inside her had finally found a crack to slip through. She cried because of the scarf, because of the crooked embroidered words, because Zoe had sat somewhere and stitched each letter by hand while thinking of her, because Briggs was trying to look away so she wouldn't feel embarrassed, because the table had burned fish and undercooked potatoes and crooked candles and cake bought from a bakery, because all those things together became something Kira had never had in her 27 years of life. A family. Not perfect, not like any family she had ever seen in movies or books, but a family. And for the first time in her life, Kira Walsh felt that she belonged somewhere. Not because someone had given her a place to stay, not because someone had paid her hospital bill, but because someone had stitched her into a scarf and called her home for dinner. Zoe sat down beside Kira and said nothing, only placed a hand on her shoulder for a moment, then let go. Barrett sat at the head of the table. He didn't stand up, didn't say, "Don't cry," didn't say anything at all. He only placed his hand on the tabletop, beside Kira's hand, not touching, just close enough for her to know he was there. Kira didn't look down. She didn't need to. She could feel it. Dinner ended late. Everyone left one by one. Briggs was the last, nodding to Barrett at the door before stepping into the night. Zoe went to bed after washing the dishes, something she insisted on doing herself because, "I cooked, so I wash." The house grew quiet again. Kira sat alone in the dining room, the new scarf in her hands. Her mother's old scarf still wrapped around her neck. 2 scarves. One from someone she had lost, one from someone she had just found. She held them both to her chest and closed her eyes. 2 years later, Troy Mercer stood before the federal courthouse in Chicago on a Monday morning in November, wearing a suit chosen by his lawyer, his face far paler than the polished man who had once sat at the bar flirting with Zoe Gallagher. The chain of consequences that began the night he abandoned a 19-year-old girl in an empty industrial district had carried him farther than he had ever imagined. Financial violations, illegal transactions, tax evasion. Everything the Mercer family had kept hidden for so many years now lay on the judge's desk. Troy was convicted. The sentence wasn't light. Hugh Mercer, his father, didn't go to prison, but he lost things worse than prison. Mercer Tower was sold to pay debt. Contracts were canceled. Partners turned their backs. The reputation he had spent 30 years building collapsed in 6 months. Hugh Mercer now lived in a rented apartment in the suburbs, waking up every day to see one more thing disappear, exactly as Barrett Gallagher had said, word for word, in that sealed room. Zoe Gallagher was 22 years old. She opened a small coffee shop on a corner in Pilsen, the colorful neighborhood southwest of Chicago. The shop wasn't large. 12 tables, a small counter, glass windows looking out onto a tree-lined sidewalk. Zoe ran it herself, managed it herself, made coffee herself every morning, closed it herself every night. Barrett came to the shop every morning at 7 o'clock. He sat at the corner table by the window, ordered black coffee, and read the news on his phone. Zoe's coffee wasn't the best in Chicago. Barrett knew that. Zoe also knew Barrett knew, but he still came. Every morning, because he didn't come for the coffee. He came because he wanted to sit there and watch his sister stand behind the counter, confident, at ease, speaking to customers with a smile she didn't have to fake. Zoe was no longer the girl who had run away. She was no longer the girl curled in a dark alley. She was someone who had chosen to stay, chosen to carry responsibility, chosen to build something with her own hands. And Barrett Gallagher, the boss of the South Side, sat in the corner of that small coffee shop in Pilsen every morning, drinking coffee that wasn't very good, and felt more satisfied than he ever had after signing any $1 million deal. Kira Walsh was 29 years old. She no longer cleaned offices. 6 months earlier, she had completed a certificate in operations management, a program she had signed up for herself, paid for herself with the wages she earned cleaning, and studied through lectures on her phone every night after work. Then she applied for a job at a retail chain, went to the interview herself, answered for herself, and was hired as a branch operations manager. Barrett had once offered to arrange a position for her in Gallagher's legal business system, higher pay, more stability, easier. Kira refused. "I need to know I can do it without you." Barrett didn't ask a second time. He understood, because that was Kira, because that was what he respected most about her. Kira still lived in Barrett's house, but no one called it staying there or repaying a debt anymore. The rent envelope still appeared on the kitchen table every month. Barrett still didn't touch it. By now, more than 20 envelopes were stacked neatly in the corner of the table. It was a silent war they both knew would never have a winner, and both of them were fine with that. One early morning in March, Chicago had just come through winter. The first sunlight of spring was pale but warm, slanting across the front porch of Barrett's house. Kira sat in the chair outside, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching the city wake. Inside the living room, hanging on the wall, was her mother's old wool scarf. It had been framed. Behind clear glass, the faded silvery gray yarn resting quietly against white fabric, the two patches in different colored yarn still clearly visible. Zoe had been the one to suggest framing it. Kira agreed. She no longer needed to wrap that scarf around her neck every night. She had the scarf Zoe had given her, but she kept one thing, a small strand of yarn, pulled from the corner of the old scarf, tied around her left wrist. No one asked what that strand of yarn was. No one needed to ask. The door behind Kira opened. Barrett stepped onto the porch, holding 2 cups. He looked at the cup of coffee in Kira's hand. It had gone cold. He set the fresh cup beside her and took the cold one away. Then he sat down in the chair beside her. He said nothing. The two of them sat there, watching Chicago brighten. Kira Walsh, the woman who had once been invisible. Barrett Gallagher, the man who once had no weakness, sitting side by side on the porch, drinking coffee. On the first morning of spring, it all began with an old wool scarf. And kindness, something that can't be bought with money, can't be forced with power, can't be threatened into existence through fear, changed everything. Sometimes, the most precious thing you can give isn't money, isn't power. It is care when no one is watching. Kindness when you yourself have almost nothing left. Kira Walsh had nothing but an old wool scarf. But she gave it away, and received an entire family in return. Kira and Barrett's story ends here. Thank you for listening all the way to the final minute. If this story touched your heart, please hit like to support us, and share this video with the people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you can listen to more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Which part moved you the most? Please share the feelings from deep inside your heart in the comments below. We always read and cherish every line you write. Wishing all of you watching this video truly good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.